So Trump canceled the summit, and by the time Washington announced it, the leverage was already gone. Not a tactical delay, not a scheduling issue, not a misunderstanding between allies. A cancellation that arrived after the outcome had already moved somewhere else. Because what happened here was not that Canada walked away from a negotiation it still needed. What happened is that Ottawa spent weeks building a position in which the meeting itself was no longer the center of gravity. And once that happens, once the other side realizes the room they prepared for no longer contains the real decision, cancellation stops looking like strength. It starts looking like recognition. Quiet recognition, late recognition, but recognition all the same. According to officials who were briefed on the sequence, the most important developments did not happen in front of cameras, and they did not happen in Washington. They happened in drafts, in calls, in side letters, in technical annexes, and in the kind of overnight coordination that almost never gets public attention until the political theater collapses around it. By the time the cancellation became public, the market was already treating the original pressure campaign as something that had lost its teeth. That is the part people need to understand. The announcement came last, the repricing came first, and the markets noticed. The Canadian dollar strengthened, export names with North American exposure recovered, logistics firms that had spent weeks trading as if cross-border uncertainty would widen started to reverse. Analysts who had been talking about brinkmanship began talking about substitution, rerouting, and operational resilience. In other words, investors stopped asking whether Ottawa would yield and started asking how much of Washington's pressure had already been neutralized behind the scenes. That is a very different question, and it is a much more expensive question for the White House to answer. Hit subscribe because what happens in the next few weeks will determine whether this was a one-off embarrassment or the beginning of a larger strategic recalibration that every trading partner in the world will study. Your retirement account pays for this kind of confusion whether you follow trade policy or not. Your 401k pays for it. Your purchasing power pays for it. Your fixed income pays for it. And according to me, it is only going to get more expensive from here. Because once allies start building around American volatility instead of through it, the cost does not show up in one headline. It compounds through pricing, through confidence, through capital allocation, and through the simple fact that uncertainty always gets billed to the public. Now, before I continue, I want to quickly mention something that I think every American over 50 needs to see right now. Everything we have been covering here, tariffs, inflation, the impact on retirement savings, the way policy shocks roll directly into household finances, I have compiled all of it into a complete guide called the Buffett Blueprint. It applies Warren Buffett's core principles to the specific risks this kind of trade conflict creates for your 401k, your Social Security outlook, and your income planning. It is a practical protection plan you can start using this week. The link is right below this video. It is called the Buffett Blueprint. Check it out. Now let me walk you through the full context, because the cancellation only makes sense if you understand what Ottawa had already finished before Washington decided to call the whole thing off. The public story started with pressure. That is how these episodes always begin. Pressure, deadlines, vague threats, confident language, selective leaks, and a familiar assumption that size alone would settle the argument. Officials in Washington believed that if they compressed the timetable tightly enough and signaled enough political impatience, Canada would conclude it had no real choice except to come into the room and accept a narrower set of outcomes. The model was simple: create urgency, narrow the options, force the symbolic meeting, then use the image of cooperation to turn an asymmetrical result into a domestic political win. On paper, it looked efficient. In practice, it misunderstood the counterparty. Because Ottawa did not answer the pressure with defiance alone, it answered with sequence. That is the word that matters here: sequence. According to people familiar with the planning, Canadian officials spent the early phase not trying to win the public argument, but trying to rearrange the order in which decisions would matter. Instead of treating the Washington meeting as the event that would define everything else, they treated it as one possible node in a much larger framework. They mapped exposure sector by sector. They identified which American threats carried real operational consequences and which were mostly political signaling. They isolated time-sensitive dependencies. They tested which suppliers could be replaced, which shipping patterns could be rerouted, which procurement channels could be accelerated, and which allied governments were quietly prepared to help stabilize any transition. Sources with knowledge of those internal discussions describe a process that was less emotional than many people expected and much more administrative. There were working groups, there were updated risk tables, there were overnight memos sent across ministries, there were calls with industry, transportation, energy, agriculture, pension specialists, and provincial representatives. There was a repeated emphasis on one question. If Washington chooses pressure over predictability, how much of that pressure can be converted into a delay problem rather than a structural problem? That distinction became central. Delay problems are survivable. Structural dependence is not. By the second week, according to officials briefed on the matter, Canadian planners had divided the American pressure points into three categories. The first category contained threats that were politically loud but economically awkward to sustain. The second category contained measures that would hurt in the short term but could be diluted through allied coordination. The third category contained the genuinely sensitive inputs, the things nobody wanted disrupted because they fed too deeply into long-term industrial capacity and pricing stability. It was around that third category that Ottawa began constructing what one source described as the off-ramp before the collision. Not a press release, not a speech, a system. The room where part of the American strategy was refined was described by people familiar with the planning as formal, highly choreographed, and almost theatrical in its symmetry. A long polished table, folders placed in identical stacks, domestic briefing notes on one side, cross-border exposure summaries on the other. A large digital schedule on the wall showing the narrowing path toward the proposed summit. People in that room believed time favored the side setting the deadline. But time only favors you if the other side still needs the meeting. That is where the miscalculation began. What Ottawa did next was not dramatic enough for television, which is exactly why it worked. According to sources who were told about the process, Canada accelerated side understandings with alternative buyers, alternative processors, alternative transit partners, and alternative financial backstops. Some of those discussions had existed in preliminary form already. What changed was the level of seriousness. What had been contingency planning became active sequencing. Drafts that had been informational became executable. Technical teams that had been standing by were told to prepare implementation timetables. Lawyers were given language to tighten. Trade specialists were told to stop thinking in terms of negotiating posture and start thinking in terms of operational continuity. This is the moment most casual observers miss. They think leverage disappears only when somebody publicly rejects it. That is not how leverage usually dies. Leverage dies quietly, when the target builds a credible path around the pressure. Sometimes the threatening side does not realize it for days, sometimes for weeks. By then, the argument on television is already stale. Sources on both sides of the border describe a critical 72-hour period in which the Canadian side stopped asking what could be salvaged from the summit and started asking what had to be finalized before the summit became irrelevant. That shift changed the tempo entirely. Calls that had been exploratory became confirmatory. Review sessions that had focused on diplomatic language began focusing on implementation language. Page counts expanded. Annexes multiplied. Sector notes were cross-referenced against custom scenarios, inventory cycles, and transportation contingencies. What was being assembled was not one grand replacement for the American relationship. It was something more sophisticated than that. A distributed alternative, strong enough in combination that no single canceled meeting could put Ottawa back into a corner. According to sources with direct knowledge, one of the most important internal documents produced during that stretch was a framework memo that tied together supply resilience, tariff exposure, cross-border timing, and communications discipline. It was not written to sound inspiring. It was written to survive execution. That is often how you can tell whether governments are still posturing or already governing. The language gets uglier. The verbs get more practical. Signed, registered, triggered, transmitted, filed, activated. That vocabulary began appearing everywhere. And while all that was happening, the public narrative in Washington remained unusually confident. Officials continued speaking as if the summit itself would be the decisive arena. That confidence was not entirely fake. People there genuinely believed the meeting could still compel alignment, because they were still thinking in terms of optics and hierarchy. Bigger economy, bigger room, bigger stage, bigger microphone. But in trade conflicts, hierarchy matters less the moment substitution becomes credible. Then the arithmetic changes. Then the side that expected submission suddenly has to calculate attrition. People briefed on Ottawa's approach say Canadian officials became increasingly disciplined about one thing. They refused to over-celebrate their own progress. No leaks designed to humiliate Washington. No premature declaration of victory. No rhetorical chest thumping. The reason was simple. If the United States fully understood, too early, how much had already been secured elsewhere, it might escalate before the alternatives were fully locked in. So the strategy became almost paradoxical. Move quickly, but look patient. Secure options, but sound constructive. Reduce dependence, but keep speaking the language of cooperation. That is not weakness. That is strategic camouflage. There was also a domestic political dimension. Ottawa had to look firm without looking reckless. It had to reassure industries exposed to short-term disruption while quietly telling them that continuity planning was further along than most of them realized. It had to coordinate with provinces whose political incentives were not identical. And it had to manage allied conversations without creating the impression of a bloc forming openly against Washington. That takes control. That takes message discipline. That takes the kind of internal coherence that many larger governments assume smaller ones cannot sustain for very long. In this case, they sustained it long enough. By the time the summit date approached, what Washington thought it was threatening had already changed shape. Instead of facing a partner cornered into a last-minute concession, the White House was facing a counterpart that had already reduced the summit's value to symbolism. Yes, a meeting could still be useful. Yes, public harmony still mattered. But usefulness is not the same thing as necessity. Once the summit stopped being necessary, cancellation stopped being a weapon. It became an admission. Sources who were informed of the final lead-up say the decisive mood shift on the American side came when internal reviews showed that several Canadian fallback arrangements were no longer theoretical. They had signatures. They had implementation windows. They had enough institutional backing that undoing them would require Ottawa to reverse itself, not merely pause. That was the key realization. Canada was no longer bluffing with optionality. It was beginning to operationalize it. The meeting room had been prepared. Briefing binders were updated. Press language had been drafted in multiple versions depending on outcome. Seating charts existed. Arrival windows existed. Motorcade planning existed. But the substance had moved. Sources describe a late internal exchange in Washington in which the political value of proceeding with the summit began to collide with the strategic danger of exposing that the United States no longer held decisive leverage. If the meeting went ahead and Ottawa arrived already insulated, the cameras could capture not a concession, but a limit. And for an administration that had sold the pressure campaign as proof of control, visible limits were unacceptable. So the calculation flipped. What had been presented as a summit of consequence became internally a summit of risk. Risk of an ambiguous communique. Risk of a side-by-side appearance without substantive movement. Risk that reporters would discover within days that alternative arrangements had already advanced further than the White House had implied. Risk that markets would read the body language correctly. Risk that the optics would invert. And then came the cancellation. Not with the language of defeat, of course. These things never come packaged that way. The public explanation emphasized timing, conditions, scheduling, the need for additional work, the standard vocabulary governments use when they need distance from a process they no longer control. But people who were briefed on the move describe it more bluntly. The summit was canceled because the summit no longer offered the outcome Washington wanted. It no longer guaranteed hierarchy. It no longer guaranteed compliance. It no longer guaranteed that the headline would match the substance. Here is why that matters so much. When a pressure campaign ends not with the other side yielding, but with the meeting itself being withdrawn, the real question is not who looked tougher in the final statement. The real question is, what changed underneath the negotiation to make the room unnecessary? In this case, according to sources across policy and industry, What changed was that Ottawa built a credible ecosystem of alternatives fast enough to alter the American cost-benefit analysis. Markets understood the symbolism almost immediately. Analysts who had previously been focused on confrontation began emphasizing insulation. Investors started asking which sectors had the most to gain if cross-border uncertainty was no longer the only organizing principle in North American planning. Transportation names, agricultural processors, infrastructure plays, and firms tied to diversified export channels all began attracting fresh attention. That shift in analyst language is important because markets are often the first place where political narratives get translated into economic judgments. And the economic judgment here was clear. Cancellation did not restore leverage, it confirmed its erosion. Warren Buffett, who had been briefed on the broad contours of the standoff by people tracking the economic implications, responded in the kind of language that sounds simple until you realize how devastating it is. In 94 years, Buffett said, I have seen governments mistake size for optionality many times. The ones who manage their position well understand that power is not what you can announce. Power is what still works after the other side has had time to prepare. The ones who manage it badly assume the announcement itself is the result. It isn't. He continued, if you pressure a close counterparty long enough, one of two things happens. Either they fold or they invest. And if they invest intelligently, your future leverage shrinks even if your present headline grows. That is one of the oldest arithmetic rules in business. You do not strengthen your bargaining power by teaching the other party how to live without you. That is vintage Buffett. Unspectacular wording, ruthless translation. He went on to say that what many people call a canceled summit is often, in economic terms, a written-off asset. People hear cancellation and think postponement. Sometimes it means postponement. Sometimes it means the expected return on the meeting has already deteriorated, and the side that called it off is trying not to display that deterioration in public. A board understands this. An investor understands this. Governments sometimes pretend not to. Then Buffett turned to the part ordinary viewers should care about most. If you are sitting at home wondering what this has to do with your savings, the answer is simple. Instability is a cost. Repeated instability is a tax. It changes investment behavior. It widens discount rates. It reduces the willingness of firms to commit capital where policy can swing before equipment even reaches the loading dock. That is not an abstract issue. It hits returns. It hits prices. It hits retirement assumptions. He also addressed the deeper strategic mistake. A lot of people still think the strongest position is the one that gets the meeting. That isn't always true. The strongest position is often the one that can afford the meeting not happening. If one side needs the room and the other side can already function outside it, the leverage question is largely settled before anyone sits down. And then came the line that, to me, summarizes the entire episode. Washington canceled the meeting. Ottawa kept the alternatives. Those are not similar things. The cancellation lasts a news cycle. The alternatives last as long as they remain useful. That is the whole case in one sentence. Because Buffett's point is not that America suddenly became weak or irrelevant. His point is narrower and more important. Specific leverage was consumed faster than policymakers realized, and once it was consumed, symbolism could not restore it. In markets, when an advantage is gone, you do not get credit for having once described it confidently. You either still have it or you don't. Governments are not exempt from that rule. Now let's talk about the consequences, because this is where the real story begins. The first consequence is precedent, and its reach is global. Every allied capital watching this sequence just received a new tutorial in how to absorb American pressure without embracing open confrontation. Not by shouting louder, not by moralizing, by preparing alternatives quietly enough that the eventual confrontation arrives late to the facts. That method will be studied, it will be adapted, it will be refined, and every time it is refined, unilateral pressure becomes a little less efficient. The second consequence is domestic American credibility. If a White House builds a public narrative around pressure, deadlines, and controlled outcomes, then ends up canceling the culminating meeting after the other side has already reduced its dependence. Domestic constituencies start asking uncomfortable questions. Industry asks whether the volatility was necessary. Investors ask whether the uncertainty was priced intelligently. Political allies ask whether the signaling campaign created more heat than leverage. None of those questions disappear simply because a summit disappears from the calendar. The third consequence is institutional learning inside Canada. Governments do not go through an episode like this and then forget the mechanics that worked. They build on them. Databases get improved. Supplier maps get updated. Allied contacts become easier to activate next time. Legal templates get saved. Interministerial trust deepens. In other words, even if the immediate conflict cools, the organizational muscle built during the conflict remains. That matters because the most durable shifts in international economics often begin as bureaucratic lessons, not speeches. The fourth consequence is business behavior. Companies hate strategic ambiguity when it affects inventory, contracting, routing, and capital expenditure. Once firms observe that policy shocks can be partially neutralized by diversified relationships and pre-negotiated alternatives, they start investing more seriously in those alternatives. They do not wait for the next crisis. They incorporate the memory of the last one into the balance sheet. That is how temporary political conflict becomes permanent commercial adjustment. The fifth consequence is bargaining psychology. Washington now has to reckon with the fact that pressure used once can be less effective the second time if the target has already learned the pattern. This is true in boardrooms. It is true in labor negotiations. It is true in geopolitics. A tactic that teaches resilience to the other party can reduce your own future room to maneuver. That is one reason sophisticated negotiators use leverage sparingly. They know the first use of a tool is never just the first use. It is also the first demonstration of the tool's limits. The sixth consequence concerns alliance structure. For decades, many U.S. partners operated on the assumption that even sharp disagreements would eventually be resolved through a stable set of expectations about process. What this episode teaches is that process itself can become contingent. When that happens, allies do not necessarily break away dramatically. They hedge. They layer, they cultivate optionality. And from Washington's perspective, hedging by allies can be more strategically corrosive than open defiance by rivals, because it happens quietly and early. The seventh consequence is monetary and market signaling. Investors are not ideological. They are pattern recognition machines. If they conclude that North American trade exposure now includes recurring bursts of politically driven uncertainty, followed by reactive bureaucratic repair, they begin pricing that pattern into assets. Risk premiums do not need to explode to matter. They merely need to stop falling. That alone can change where factories get built, where financing gets secured, and which corridors look dependable enough for long-duration investment. The eighth consequence is narrative control. One of the reasons governments like summits is that summits create images. Images compress complexity. A handshake can obscure a concession. A joint statement can postpone scrutiny. A canceled summit does the opposite. It invites people to ask what could not be staged. It opens a vacuum, and vacuums get filled by analysts, by markets, by opposition politicians, by industry, and by foreign governments trying to infer what the cancellation reveals. In that sense, once the meeting was called off, Washington did not gain narrative control. It lost the easiest instrument it had for managing appearances. The ninth consequence is structural. Alternatives, once tested, often become permanent, even if they were born as contingencies. A supplier brought in during a dispute may still be there 2 years later if performance is acceptable. A transport route entered under political stress may remain attractive because it reduced concentration risk. A financing arrangement designed as a fallback may become part of normal planning. This is how temporary pressure can create lasting diversification. And lasting diversification is simply another name for reduced leverage. The 10th consequence is the one Buffett would probably emphasize most: compounding. People think of trade fights as episodic. Investors know better. The costs compound. Delayed investments compound. Confidence shocks compound. Managerial caution compounds. Insurance adjustments compound. Portfolio reallocations compound. Once enough actors internalize the lesson that policy stability is less reliable than assumed, their individual defensive decisions add up to a macroeconomic drag. Not always dramatic, often quiet, but real. And there is a final geopolitical consequence as well. Rivals watch allied friction closely. They do not need to win every contest themselves if they can benefit from strategic wear inside opposing networks. Every canceled summit between allies, every avoidable burst of uncertainty, every demonstration that pressure produces hedging rather than obedience, all of that gets observed abroad. The question foreign strategists ask is not whether the alliance still exists. The question is whether its internal predictability is weakening. Even a small reduction in predictability can carry outsized consequences over time. There is a specific kind of political mistake that looks forceful in the moment and expensive only later. It is the mistake of confusing a stage with a structure. Stages are where governments perform certainty. Structures are where power actually lives. A meeting is a stage. A contingency network is a structure. A press statement is a stage. A signed alternative is a structure. Cancellation can protect a stage for a day. It does not erase a structure once built. That is why this episode matters beyond the personalities involved. It shows what happens when one side treats time as pressure and the other side treats time as preparation. It shows the difference between commanding attention and commanding outcomes. It shows why governments that underestimate administrative competence in smaller partners can walk themselves into a strategic surprise. And it shows why markets so often see the truth before politicians admit it, because markets care less about theater than about continuity. So keep an eye on the indicators that actually matter. Keep an eye on cross-border investment guidance. Keep an eye on procurement shifts. Keep an eye on transportation contracts, storage commitments, and the language companies use in earnings calls when they talk about resilience, routing, and sourcing flexibility. Keep an eye on whether Canadian planners unwind any of the alternatives that were accelerated during this confrontation. If they do not unwind them, then the cancellation was not a pause in the old model. It was a milestone in a new one. And keep an eye on Washington as well, because the next move will tell you whether the lesson has been learned. If policymakers respond by trying to recreate the same pressure with louder rhetoric, then they have misunderstood the arithmetic. If they respond by rebuilding predictability, narrowing volatility, and recognizing that allies who are pushed too hard become more capable rather than more compliant, then this episode may still have a productive afterlife. But as of now, the signal is plain. Trump canceled the summit. Ottawa kept the alternatives. One of those is an event, the other is a position. And in trade, in politics, and in markets, position is what lasts. If you want, I can turn this into